What if I told you that in medieval Europe, money wasn't always gold, or that a hot bath meant a communal tub, maybe once a year, and clean drinking water? Forget about it. This wasn't some fantasy land. This was a world where your survival depended on your place on a brutal social ladder, and the definition of wealth, from land to a single, hard-earned meal, might shock you. We're about to dive into the surprisingly gritty reality of medieval wealth, from the dirt poor to the dazzlingly rich. Get ready to see history through a totally different and often very grubby lens. Before anyone could even think about wealth, Europe had to simply exist. From the chaos after Rome's fall through about the year 1000, daily life was a constant scramble. The population of Europe had actually fallen and remained low for centuries. Imagine a continent that felt like a no-man's land, dotted with tiny, scattered villages, people huddled together, desperate for protection in an environment of constant fear and instability. The devastating invasions of the Vikings and other groups in the 9th and 10th centuries didn't help. Their unspoken deal? Your labor, your loyalty, for a chance to live. Here, protection, such as it was, came directly from the warrior elite. Land wasn't just power back then, it was the bedrock of all survival. Beggars literally owned nothing but the clothes on their backs, if they were lucky. Their wealth was pure luck, a prayer, a sympathetic glance, maybe a crust of bread tossed their way by the church, which they heavily relied on for any hope of food or shelter. Some Christians viewed giving to them as a sacred duty. Others just saw them as a nuisance. Think about the irony. War veterans, disabled and forgotten after conflicts, often had nowhere else to go but to join their desperate, vulnerable ranks. Meals, infrequent, uncertain, and stomach-turning. Imagine eating just once a day, if that, a mouthful of thin pottage, probably shared with flies. Hygiene? Forget it. Bathing wasn't a concept for these folks. They slept in the dirt, smelled of it, and drank from whatever polluted river or stagnant puddle was available. A constant gamble with dysentery and death. Just above them, landless laborers and servants were the workhorses of medieval society. Their wealth was their physical ability to work. They worked for lords, artisans, or rich farmers, and their payment was essentially room and board. Here's a grim detail. They often ate the same meal as their employers, but in much smaller, less desirable portions. When winter hit with work drying up, they faced instant layoffs and starvation. Imagine that constant insecurity. Yet some were incredibly resourceful. They saved tiny amounts over time, slowly acquiring skills by slyly overhearing the Lord's tutors, a rare, precarious path to slight improvement. Hygiene was primitive. They might splash some freezing river water on their faces. Drinking water came from communal wells or streams, often shared with livestock. Cleanliness was a luxury they literally couldn't afford. Then there were the landless peasants. They had a modicum of freedom, working more like independent contractors than permanent employees. Their wealth was pure grit and the freedom to move. They constantly traveled, following rumors of available farmland. The level of fair treatment by their employers could vary wildly, from decent to ruthless. And then there were the minstrels, the medieval world's original influencers and de facto newspapers. Their wealth was their talent, their memory, memorizing hundreds of intricate tales and songs, and their closely guarded instruments. They wandered town to town, performing epic tales and songs. But here's the kicker. They could swing from rags to riches and back again in a single week. One day feasting on roasted swan in a castle, the next begging for dirty water and a sleeping spot in a pigsty. Their social acceptance varied wildly, making them the medieval reality TV stars, famous but often disdained. Moving up a tiny rung, we find the smallholding peasants. Their wealth wasn't outright ownership, as we understand it today. Land was granted following ancient customs, but it could rarely be sold. This created an agricultural community with a cooperative organization aimed at collective survival during periods of extreme instability. They had autonomy over what they planted, but crucially, their relationships within the community were vital. They bartered a lot. Instead of paying taxes to a state, they rendered service directly to other individuals. They provided work for the lord as a kind of tax, but then had their own land to cultivate. This system was managed by the village reeve. Imagine a medieval middle manager. The reeve was appointed, organized farm work on the lord's land, collected taxes, and acted as judge for minor cases. They received perks, but their relationships with everyone were incredibly complicated. Meals for smallholders were more consistent, usually twice a day. Dark, dense bread was the staple, supplemented with cheese, eggs from their few chickens, and thick pottage made from oats, peas, or beans. Meat was still a special occasion, but here's a common medieval hack. They often drank small beer, a very weak, low-alcohol ale, throughout the day. Why? Because the brewing process killed off bacteria, making it far safer than the questionable well or river water everyone else was risking their lives on. Hygiene? Still pretty rough. A shared bath might happen a few times a year, and clothes were washed rarely, down at the grimy river. Then, everything changed. After the Black Death, the plague drastically reduced Europe's population, leading to a massive shift in the value of labor. Suddenly, peasants gained unprecedented bargaining power, leading to increased wages and greater freedoms. The old system, based on an abundance of cheap labor, spectacularly cracked. As the old system fractured, a truly fascinating class emerged, the freemen. They weren't wealthy enough to be upper class, but they had a lot of autonomy. Their wealth was owned land, often several fields, agricultural surplus, and the ability to navigate a market economy. They paid multiple taxes directly to the crown, sold their surplus produce at market, learned new skills, and enjoyed significant social mobility. They even had military obligations, which could further boost their standing. And in some cases, they could purchase minor titles, slowly ascending the social ladder. Meals for freemen were heartier and more varied, often including more meat, pork, fowl, fresh vegetables from their own gardens, and finer bread. They'd enjoy beer or cider regularly. They likely had access to better private wells or springs for drinking water, reducing contamination risk, though understanding of germ theory was still centuries away. Hygiene was still basic by modern standards, but they could afford clean clothes more often. But the real disruption, the true engine of new wealth, lay with the merchants. These guys were the medieval logistics experts. Their wealth was liquid capital, goods, and a sprawling web of crucial connections. From the bustling trade hubs of Italy to the rich textile towns of Flanders, areas of incredibly high urban population densities, long-distance commerce between them flourished. Travel was incredibly dangerous, but the profits could be astronomical. They developed sophisticated business contracts, like the Commenda for sea trade and the Societas and Compagnia for overland, allowing them to pool capital, bringing together investors and merchants. The famous Champagne fairs became significant international commercial hubs. Risk management was a constant, terrifying concern. Here's a fun fact. Merchants often had more money than knights, but not as much cultural cachet. Yet, the most successful of them lived like minor nobles, commanding immense resources, enjoying exotic foods and spices from their travels, and many eventually entered into the landed gentry, proving that money, eventually, could buy you anything, even old world status. And yes, they had access to the best available water, often from deeper, cleaner wells, and could afford perfumes and clean linens to mask the ever-present medieval funk. Now, we're heading to the traditional top, the warrior class. Knights were the warrior aristocracy, embodying the ideal medieval man, pious, brave, and loyal. Young boys started as pages for a knight, learning weapons, then became knights themselves. Their wealth was their landed gentry status and the means to support their military supplies. They served a lord, typically for about 40 days a year. But being a knight was eye-wateringly expensive. The heavy armor, the specialized war horses, the intricate weapons, and maintaining a personal retinue drained resources. Economic pressures increased as military costs rose, and farming income often didn't cover it all. Here's their perk. They were exempt from many taxes and could only be judged by other nobles. Still, many knights, despite their ideals, struggled to keep their estates afloat. For knights, meals were lavish when on campaign or at court. Imagine roasted game, fine breads, rivers of wine. At home, they ate well, if less theatrically than nobles. They had access to private wells within their keeps and could always afford good beer and wine. Hygiene was better, with access to bathing facilities, but daily bathing as we know it simply wasn't a thing, even for them. It was more about keeping clothes clean and appearing presentable. Above them were the nobles, the barons, counts, and dukes. Their wealth was immense, vast territories, military power, and the control of entire communities. In exchange for military service and dispensing justice, a noble received a grant of land, called a manor, from the monarch or another noble. This wasn't just a house. It was essentially a village, including the people, often serfs bound to the land, their dwellings, and all the tools for survival. Serfs, exploited by the warrior elite, were bound to that land. This manorial system developed across much of modern-day France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, northern Italy, Germany, and later England, after the Norman conquest. Barons owned multiple estates and commanded many knights. They advised kings and dukes. With medieval states often too weak to ensure local security, these lords fulfilled this crucial role. This arrangement allowed monarchs to maintain theoretical control while delegating real authority to the nobles. Their military power was the foundation of their authority, overseeing huge administrative organizations. Ever heard of a robber baron? Some of these were literally merchants who acted like mafia bosses, accumulating enough wealth and influence to challenge royal authority and even spin off into their own countries. Dukes were the highest level of nobility, overseeing several baronies. Their territories often covered entire cultural areas, kind of like states within a kingdom. They earned income through land, judicial fees, taxes, and trade route fees. They were major advisors to kings, key figures in succession disputes, and often competed with other duchies for the best poets, musicians, and architects. Sometimes, they even became kings themselves through marriage or conquest. Not all pathways to power involved land or the sword. Some wielded immense influence from places you might not expect, the pulpit and the counting house. Bishops held an almost unbelievable combination of spiritual authority and immense wealth. Their wealth was centuries of accumulated church lands, massive tithes, and endless donations from the faithful. They held absolute authority within their dioceses, with territorial claims that rivaled secular nobles. They oversaw massive bureaucracies, led educational institutions, and sometimes even commanded military groups in the interest of the church. Here's the shocker. In some regions, powerful bishops rivaled or even exceeded the power of kings themselves. Bishops lived incredibly well, enjoying refined meals, imported delicacies, and the choicest wines from their vast church estates. They generally had access to the best and cleanest water sources within their abbeys and cathedrals, and higher standards of personal cleanliness were expected within monastic life, though still not daily bathing. Then there were the bankers, immensely wealthy, yet often deeply despised. Their wealth was liquid capital, complex financial instruments, and unique expertise. They started by providing basic financial services to merchants, then expanded. Here's a dark truth. Because Christian canon law strictly forbade charging interest on loans, usury, the incredibly lucrative practice of money lending often fell to Jewish communities who were outside the church's jurisdiction. Banking as we know it largely developed in medieval Italy as an offshoot of commerce. There were three types: pawnbrokers, money changers, and deposit banks. But until the 14th century, most banking was done by wealthy merchants themselves, as they had the volume of money for deposit banking and experience in international trade. Since credit at interest was illegal, merchants and bankers developed clever mechanisms to hide the interest. The most common, the bill of exchange. It had huge advantages: no risky money transfers between cities, and it allowed for loans at interest by hiding the interest within the exchange rate. Bankers enjoyed meals comparable to or even exceeding wealthy merchants, with a taste for luxury goods and fine wines. As urban dwellers, they sought out the cleanest available city wells, frequented public bathhouses, if the city had them, and employed servants to ensure cleanliness. At the very pinnacle of the social pyramid stood the kings. They claimed divine right, asserting absolute ownership over all land in their kingdom, and held supreme legal and military power. Their royal court served as the highest judiciary, their cabinet positions, and the ultimate social circle. Theoretically, their wealth was limitless. But here's the brutal reality. Their actual power was always a precarious balancing act. It depended entirely on keeping their powerful, often rebellious nobles loyal, skillfully navigating treacherous court politics, and constantly finding ways to finance their frequent, ruinously expensive wars. The military power of a king was the absolute foundation of their authority. The strongest kings left legacies that defined entire civilizations. The weakest, unable to control their unruly vassals or secure their finances, were often little more than figureheads, their crowns hollow symbols. Kings held elaborate, multi-day feasts, not just meals, but theatrical displays of power designed to impress and control their nobles. Imagine endless courses of roasted oxen, whole wild boar, even swans and peacocks, alongside fine pastries, exotic fruits, and rivers of the finest imported wine. Their daily meals were always incredibly varied and plentiful. They had access to the best private water sources within their palaces and castles, often specifically dug deep wells, and would use expensive scented oils and fine linens for personal hygiene, maintaining an appearance of cleanliness. But even for them, a truly clean existence by our standards was practically unimaginable. So what did wealth really mean in the medieval world? It wasn't just about accumulating gold or owning endless fields of grain. It was about your name, your family's history, the land you controlled, the labor you commanded, your crucial alliances, and sometimes the fickle hand of luck. From beggars to bankers, everyone played their part in a fragile, ever-shifting order. And while the grand castles and powerful kings often catch our attention, it was often the farmers, traders, and even the wandering minstrels, who, in their own ways, literally kept medieval society together. Thanks for watching. For clear, compelling history, subscribe to Long History Short, your shortcut to the whole story.